I always say when I feel like people are just rushing this or this has to happen because this person's coming out of prison next week and we have to figure this out, it's like, no, these are things that require, you know, God, intentionality, thoughtfulness, and time. And
Mhm.
for it to be safe, we need all four of those things, I believe, in the long run to make this work and to ensure that we're thinking about everyone in the picture, just not the person who committed the sexual offense behavior.
Welcome to the Faithful and True podcast. We come to you today again with a return visitor to the show. Elizabeth Griffin from the Faithful and True team has agreed to join us to continue a conversation that we started on the last podcast, talking about safety and the various forms of safety. And Greg, what is today's slant on safety going to be?
Well, I want to just say we're going to kind of go into a challenging and difficult conversation. We want to acknowledge at the beginning that this is complex. And so, what we're going to be talking about is when there has been offending behavior, what does it look like to create safety in the home and in the community when the offender returns? And many of the men who come through Faithful and True, this is a part of their story. They did some sort of offending behavior. They got caught. They got prosecuted. They did their time, their sentence, and now they're looking at coming back into their home, maybe even into their church community. And what does it look like to navigate that will be safe for everyone? And so, as Randy mentioned, Elizabeth is with us again, and we are so thankful for you to be here, to be a part of this conversation, because this is a world, a reality that you function in. And so we really want to hear from you what it looks like for families and communities to be safe and to create places for people who have offended. So thanks for being with
You're
us.
welcome.
I would say that as we've talked about this and as we've worked with others to navigate it, um, what do you think are the questions that people begin with as they consider this? The wife who's hearing that maybe the husband is coming back home, or the church that the offender may be coming back to church. What gets stirred up in people?
Well, I think we have a lot of myths about people who commit sexual offenses. The myths are that everyone's the same, that everyone is going to do this again, that every single individual is very dangerous. And while that can be true for some individuals, the reality is that people who commit sexual offenses are on a continuum from people
Mm.
who are very low risk, who are never going to do this again, especially with treatment and appropriate interventions, to people who the likelihood of them committing another sexual offense is very high. And so
Yeah.
I think we have so many fears, and not that those aren't legitimate, they are, but we have a lot of beliefs in our head about who is a sex offender. And the reality is that most children are sexually abused by someone they know in their community or by a family member. And now we're also seeing a large group of individuals who viewed images of child pornography or child sexual abuse images and are getting prosecuted. And so, those are the two groups of people that we tend to see coming out of prison or trying to integrate back into families or into our church communities.
Yeah. What's interesting is you were talking about the myths. One of them that came to my mind was if you have ever been an unsafe person before, you will always be an unsafe person. And so if it was that simple where okay, you did this behavior, you were unsafe for others, well, you will never be safe for others again. So therefore, we will just exclude you. Well, what makes it complicated is, as you mentioned on the continuum, we recognize that there are those people that, yes, they made choices in the past that were offensive and hurtful and unsafe. Um, and now they have the opportunity to do life differently. How do we support them in that? And our fear, I think, is that we are going to misjudge the
Mhm.
situation and we're going to trust someone again who isn't trustworthy. And how do we discern that?
And I think, the key is to finding that balance. How can we help you find and develop your protective factors? We know that people who've committed sexual offenses, who have the support of family and friends and church and community, are much less likely to engage in the behavior again, because being a part of a community is a protective factor. And so, the trick is finding how can we have accountability and still welcome you back into the family or the community. And oftentimes, the legal system is going to help us with some of those decisions because they're going to
Hmm.
be rules. But I also, say to churches, like, obviously this isn't someone you want to be teaching the Sunday school class to the youth of the church. However, this is someone who might do a great job teaching a Sunday school class to the adult individuals in the church, like
Hmm.
learning to have how do you have accountability. Maybe this is someone that needs a mentor to be with him when he arrives at the church, who is going to just be a second set of eyes, who's going to make sure that nothing inappropriate in terms of having conversations with children, or taking talking to a child privately for a long period of time or anything like that is going to happen. So there certainly are ways to have both accountability and welcome people back into the community.
Right. And one of the factors that needs to be acknowledged is the presence of victims, and the impact that that has on whether or not someone can be integrated again. And so, even as we're having this conversation about safety and how do we navigate this complexity, one of the factors that has to take into account is, are there is there the presence of direct victims, and how do we engage that? How do we create safety for the victim if the offending behavior was directed towards them? And then there's this other category of secondary victims. And the way that I would define that is, the secondary victim is not someone who was directly impacted by this person's behavior, and they had been victimized in the past. So the presence of an offender would be triggering for them. And we want to move through this in such a way that the direct victims have a sense of safety and confidence, and secondary victims can be acknowledged in the chaos that this can create for them too.
And it all comes down to education and communication. There is a great organization here in the Twin Cities. They're called the Gilead Project. And it comes out of a woman who was raised in the Catholic Church and who was sexually abused. And her partner in this endeavor is a priest who sexually abused children. And they have
Mm.
created this format for churches called the Uncommon Conversation, where they have a very specific dialogue that happens, that people hear um, her side as the victim and his side of someone who has sexually harmed others, and then other leaders in the church to talk about their reaction to it. So I think that a huge key to this happening is to be able to have those kind of conversations, even in your
Mhm.
church, before you have the situation, that you are talking about how do we help victims, and how could we assist people who've caused sexual harm, and can we have a conversation about what it's like for a victim to be in the presence of someone who's sexually harmed, and what it's like for someone who's sexually harmed to hear the impact that they've had, not necessarily on their victim, but someone else who's been victimized. So there are
Right.
ways, I think, to have the conversation, but it's a conversation that's complicated and should not happen on the day that you're welcoming someone from the community who's sexually harmed back to your church. It
Right.
needs to
Well,
have a plan in place way ahead of time.
Well, and I want to go back to that idea of education that, if I'm trying to navigate something that is this complex, it is important that I have a foundation on which to move forward, that I do have an education, I do have an understanding, I do have the kind of an expert voice that is either maybe in written material or an actual person that can help us navigate something that has the potential to be incredibly redemptive and also has the possibility of being very harmful if not handled well.
I think intentionality and thoughtfulness are two key words that I always talk to communities about. That it needs to be a thoughtful process with intentionality, because it is like walking into a field of landmines that you're not sure
Hmm.
quite where those are, and you have to navigate your way through that, because as a community you certainly may not know everyone's personal story, and so there may be someone that you're not aware of that is extremely triggered by this individual being at the church. So it's really important to have those intentional, thoughtful conversations as a church leadership, as well as with the congregation.
So let's kind of um, talk maybe more specifically about how to integrate. So, if maybe it is a wife that will be welcoming a husband back home, a church that might be welcoming a former congregant back in. So, maybe the first question that both of them ask is, what is possible? You know, you alluded to this, but in many cases, the legal system creates the boundaries and the parameters under which someone must live. And so it's important that as a family or as a congregation is looking to integrate someone, they start with, given the legal realities, what is possible. What may be true is, given those realities, it may not be possible for the spouse to return home, or it may not be possible for the congregant to be at church. And it's important that everyone understand what the legal system has said the parameters are.
And I would say that in many cases it's possible, but not exactly in that moment. That for
Hmm.
in many cases where people are living in the community, the probation department is really going to want a very thoughtful, slow process to occur. And that's going to involve the individual's therapist, the pastor and leadership of the church, the spouse and her therapist, the children and their therapist. Like there are going to be a lot of voices who are going to want to weigh in about what that process looks like and how long is it going to take. And I think for spouses or for churches, it's really important to realize that that process is in place to ensure safety, and why it can be very frustrating, because I think families often want to immediately pull the family back together. That's usually not going to happen. It's going to be a long process with a lot of rules that everybody's going to have to follow. And I think that can be frustrated for spouses as well as for churches. I've had churches say, well, we know he's a great guy, he's a good Christian man, or I know he's a good husband. Well, it's going to take more than just knowing that. It's going to take an accountability plan so that you can ensure that everyone is safe during this process.
And I like the way that you said that. So what is possible now and what may be possible later are different. and it's important that we live in what is possible
Now,
now.
exactly. And have patience with that. And that is difficult. But I always, say to churches and families, we want to do this the right way. Because if we don't do it the right way, then the chances of this happening again increase. And nobody wants that. So being able to do this in a thoughtful, intentional, way and to develop a plan is the way that's going to keep everyone safe.
Yeah. I think a second question would be, under the circumstances, what is reasonable? What can we reasonably do, whether we're a family system trying to welcome someone back in, or we are a church system, and what one family could do may not be possible for another family. And so even to get clear about what is reasonable for this system to do to support the person returning, I think is an important conversation. There may be some things that we want to do, but given our realities financially, or given our just our possibilities, that may not be reasonable for us.
One of the things that is almost 100% required in the beginning is that someone have someone with them at all times when they're in a situation that children are present. It cannot be just a person who agrees to be there. It needs to be a person who also agrees that they can have open conversation with the person who's coming back into the family or the church. It needs to be a person who believes that this individual was capable of committing the sexual offense behavior. Lots of times, I'll have spouses or pastors who say, well, I just don't think he did it. Well, then you're not going to be the appropriate accountability person. And it
Right.
also needs to be someone that can say to the individual, I saw X and I want to talk to you about that. And so I think what I always say, that the one thing we can do is help that individual find people that will be willing to be with them, take the job seriously, be willing to have open conversations, be based in reality of what the individual did, and be willing to hold that individual accountable. And that takes some time and energy, because that's an individual who's going to want to talk to the probation officer and to the therapist. But I think that is one of the most important things we can provide people, are some individuals in their life who are willing to take on that role with them.
Right. Well, and kind of what you're talking about is this idea of being reasonable. It is a time commitment,
Mhm.
and it is an investment of energy. And so, what a small church is able to do may be different than what a large church is able to
Absolutely.
do. And having realistic expectations, what a large family that has lots of resources can do may be different than what a smaller family that doesn't have much resources. And so, again, evaluating, we may want to do this, and it's just not reasonable for us to do it.
Exactly.
I think another question that we navigate is, especially as Christians, is what is redemptive? We believe in transformation. We believe that there is hope. We believe that with grace and love that we can become new people. And so we do want to engage what is redemptive in this. And we want the person who has been victimized to be redeemed and not to be defined by what happened to them. We want the offender to be redeemed and not held hostage by the behavior that created the chaos. And so, how do we create structures, systems focusing on redemption, and at the same time live in the reality of the context of what has happened?
And I absolutely believe redemption is possible. I would not be in this field if I had not seen hundreds of examples of redemption. Redemption takes time. I
Hmm.
think oftentimes, um, everyone wants to give redemption maybe sooner than we should. And certainly the person who's committed a sexual offense, say, 99% of the time feel such shame about this behavior. And they are going back into their Christian community, their families, and they want forgiveness. And I always say, that is a process. And redemption is a
Mm.
process, because what anyone who has to change behavior that is harmful to others, you have to build a track record of trust, and you have to take the next right step, is what we talk about sometimes, to demonstrate that you are working your way on that path of redemption. And so I think it's a process. It may take several years to reach that point, or it may take 5 years to reach that point. And I always say to the men who've committed sexual offenses, you get to choose how that process goes. Because when you make choices that are the next right step, you are taking a turtle step on that road to
Mm.
redemption. But it's not going to happen in a week, a month, a year. It always is going to take 2 to 3 years to build that.
Yeah. We often say at the workshop, you can never get somebody to trust you. All you can do is be trustworthy, and then they get to determine whether or not they're going to trust you. And ironically, the more we try to get someone to trust us, the less trustworthy we
Here.
appear. And so all we can do is our journey, our program. And I do think in the church, there is this belief that if you aren't immediately transformed, then it's not God's work. And what we know is God's work is intentional and methodical, and that transformation, that journey does take
And
time.
it requires
And
something of us. It
yes,
requires us to be a part of that process. And that, I mean, I think when you talked about when you want others to trust you, is not that internal process or internal process with God. It is about wanting that um, external forgiveness or external
Mhm.
belief that I'm okay. And that really, truly does have to be between you and your relationship with God for redemption to truly
Yeah,
happen, I think.
absolutely. The next question, the fourth question I would ask is, and what is wise? As individuals, as families, as churches are trying to integrate someone who has had an offending behavior, what is wise for us to do? And we talk a lot at Faithful and True about being wise adults. And there is a wisdom part of this. And I think we believe that all wisdom comes from God. And so there may be some things that you would be able to do, but you determine at this point that's not the wise thing to do. And so trusting God's prompting, God's spirit, um, we often believe and tell people, to pay attention to your intuition. That's God's spirit in you. And there may be some caution that you have. There may be some encouragement that you have. There may be a challenge that you have, maybe to have that awkward conversation. But one of the things that we would say is for families and for churches to trust the wisdom of God in this process of integration.
And I also think, sometimes God's voice, sometimes that little voice inside of us, is because we're seeing things that we don't want to see, that we're trying to deny, but God is still trying to, like, say, you need to pay attention to this. And so I always, tell individuals that, you may be working with an individual who says, what I did wasn't that bad, or it really wasn't my fault. It was the victim's fault, or I was drunk, or
Mhm.
yes, I know I need therapy, but I just don't have time to do that. Like, those are all signs that this
Mhm.
person is not starting in the place they need to start. And I think
Mhm.
sometimes, churches and spouses see that and hear that, but want to ignore that because they so much want this person to be on that path toward redemption. And at sometimes is the person just hasn't gotten it yet, and
Mhm.
are going in that is when I think you really use prayer, use your support system to help you stay in a place in hearing God's voice that maybe what you want, it's just not time for at this point.
Right. Well, it's kind of like the wise person asks for help.
Yeah.
So if the person isn't asking for help, then we know that there's a lack of wisdom there, or the wise person owns and takes responsibility for their choices. So if there's a blaming, or instead of blame, there's shame, we know that they're not really in their wise place. We know that transformation takes time, and so if a family or a church is wanting to rush something, then we know that that may not be operating in wisdom. So there are some principles there that we can look at that help to evaluate what is the way to move forward, which brings us to the fifth question I think that is helpful to ask, and that is, what is safe? And that kind of ties us back into this series that we've been doing, is as a family is integrating an offender or someone who is offended, and a church is trying to do the same thing, we want to come back to that idea of what is safe. And this is a complex question and answer when it comes to this particular issue, because we have to take an account of what has happened in the past. And we also want to believe that transformation is possible. And in fact, what's we would say is, if there is not community, there cannot be transformation.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're wrestling with, how do we create safety in the context of bringing somebody back into the community?
And I would say that we do our best job with that when we're thoughtful and intentional, and it's a process. I always say, when I feel like people are just rushing this, or this has to happen because this person's coming out of prison next week and we have to figure this out, it's like, no, these are things that require, you know, God, intentionality, thoughtfulness, and time. And
Mm-hmm.
for it to be safe, we need all four of those things, I believe, in the long run, to make this work, and to ensure that we're thinking about everyone in the picture, just not the person who committed the sexual offense behavior.
Wow.
Well, Elizabeth, thanks for being with us. And as we conclude, I just want to acknowledge this is a complex conversation.
Mm.
This is just a drop in the bucket. This
Yes.
is not the end of the conversation. Um, this is just hopefully for those individuals or churches that are trying to navigate this. Maybe we have given words to you to begin a new conversation where you are. Maybe it's a reminder that you're not alone in this. There are others trying to figure this out. But we definitely want to say that this is complex. And ultimately, for the victims of sexual offenses, we want them to be safe as we seek to integrate and create safe spaces for people who have offended. So, Elizabeth, thanks for being with us.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Elizabeth. It's great to have you with us again today. And to our viewers, we want to thank you for listening or watching us this week on the Faithful and True podcast. We hope that today's podcast has been beneficial to you. We invite you to visit faithfulandtrue.com, where you will find over 400 of our podcasts available for you. We also have information about our men's journey workshop, our women's journey workshop, and our couples journey workshop. All three workshop models are available with new information available to you and free resources on our website. Until we join you again next week, we want to thank you. We hope that this coming week will be a week for you that's filled with many blessings and with great vision.